On January 24, 1945, in a snow-covered forest near the French village of Houssen, an American soldier did something that should have been impossible, something that defied every principle of military logic, something that would earn him recognition for one of the single greatest acts of defensive courage in the entire European campaign. His name was Louis Connor. He was 5 foot 6 inches tall. He came from the mountains of Kentucky, and by the standards of the army, he shouldn't have been on the front lines at all. He had been wounded weeks earlier and should have still been in a hospital bed. Instead, he stood alone in the snow, armed with a German submachine gun he'd stolen from a dead Nazi soldier, a weapon his own officers called a toy compared to American firepower. Behind him, defending the position they'd called K Company, were just 180 American soldiers, and coming at them through the blizzard were 600 German Waffen-SS troops, 6 Panzer tanks, and the determination to break the American line. By the end of that day, Connor would have killed 50 German soldiers, wounded 150 more, and held a position that military commanders said couldn't possibly be held. But the story isn't about what Connor did, it's about who he was before it all happened, and why nobody believed he could do it when the moment came. This is his story.
The winter of 1944-45 was brutal. The Germans had launched their Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and American forces were stretched thin. Every experienced soldier was needed on the line. Connor had just been released from field hospital. He'd been shot in the hip weeks earlier. The wound should have kept him on light duty for months. Instead, he reported back to K Company. "The boy came back, and I thought he was crazy," one of his fellow soldiers later wrote. "He could barely walk. We told him to go back to the hospital. He just shook his head and took his rifle." K Company was positioned near the village of Houssen in eastern France. They held a section of defensive line that the Germans were probing, testing for weakness. The position was exposed. The men were exhausted. The supply lines were stretched. Military intelligence reported that a major German attack was coming, not a probing attack, a full offensive push. German high command wanted to split the American line, create a pocket, and trap American forces between 2 German advances. K Company was directly in the path of that attack. The men knew what was coming. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were in bad ground, with limited supplies, and the Germans were bringing tanks. Officers made the assessments that soldiers make before major combat. "We're going to die here," one soldier told another. "They're going to come through us like a knife through butter." Officers called for reinforcements. High command said none were available. They said K Company would have to hold, just survive long enough for reserves to arrive from the rear.
Louis Connor didn't say anything. He never did. He just helped dig defensive positions, helped set up fields of fire, helped position the machine guns. He understood, in a way that civilians never could, that they were going to be asked to do something that couldn't be done, and they were going to have to do it anyway. The morning of January 24th came grey and cold. Snow fell steadily. Visibility was terrible, maybe 50 yards if you were lucky. At approximately 8 a.m., it started. Light artillery swept across the American positions. Then the infantrymen came. Hundreds of them. Waffen-SS troops, Hitler's elite soldiers, trained, indoctrinated, fanatical. They came through the snow in waves, and behind them came the tanks. 6 Panzer tanks, monsters, 9 feet tall, 27 feet long, the most powerful tanks on the battlefield, and against K Company's 180 men with rifles and machine guns, those tanks were nearly invincible. But there was a problem with the German attack. The snow was deep, the terrain was difficult, the tanks had to follow the roads and clearings, they couldn't spread out,
They had to attack in columns, and the American soldiers in K Company knew something that the German commanders didn't. They knew about Louis Connor.
In the confusion of the attack, one of K Company's men, a soldier whose name was never recorded in the history books, saw a German soldier go down. The German was carrying a captured German submachine gun, a Schmeisser MP40, beautiful weapon, fast rate of fire, deadly in close quarters. The American soldier picked it up, started to fire it, but before he could do much with it, a German sniper round took him in the shoulder. Louis Connor was there. He grabbed the German submachine gun from the wounded man, looked at it for just a moment, and then he moved. The German attack was coming from the southwest, concentrated fire. The Germans were trying to punch through the American line, split the company, and break into the rear areas. If they succeeded, K Company would collapse. Connor positioned himself at a point on the line where the German assault was heaviest, an exposed position, a place where you'd be visible to every German sniper and every German machine gun. One of his fellow soldiers, Private Haddix, later described what he saw. "I saw Connor just stand up there in the open, no cover. The bullets were flying around him like a swarm of hornets. He had that German gun in his hands, and he just started firing. I couldn't believe he wasn't hit. I thought I was watching a dead man stand there and fight." Connor fired the Schmeisser in controlled bursts. He'd learned the weapon somehow, maybe from captured German soldiers, maybe from examining German guns on the battlefield. He knew its characteristics, knew how to control it, knew how to use it to maximum effect. But the thing that made Louis Connor impossible wasn't his weapon. It was something else entirely. He could see them.
In the snow, in the blizzard, in conditions where other men were nearly blind, Connor could see German soldiers moving through the snow, and every German he saw got shot. With icy self-control, he kept directing our fire, one of his officers wrote in the official report. Although he must have seen that the Germans would have killed him before he could get on his feet, he never flinched, he never hesitated, he just kept fighting. The Schmeisser got hot. Connor switched to a rifle, then back to the Schmeisser. He fired so many rounds that empty shell casings piled up around his position. Later, when they were counted, there were piles of brass at his feet, hundreds of rounds expended by one man. The German attack kept coming, wave after wave. They were professional soldiers. They were trained. They were determined. They should have broken through easily. K Company should have been overrun. But Louis Connor was in the way. And Louis Connor did not break. January 24th, 1945. The battle for K Company position. The battle raged for hours. Time loses meaning in combat, but later calculations would show that from approximately 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 8 hours, the Germans made repeated assaults on the K Company position. Tank attacks, infantry waves, coordinated assaults using fire and maneuver. And Louis Connor was everywhere. When the Germans probed the left flank, Connor was there, firing from an exposed position. When they pushed the right, Connor moved to meet them. When they tried to mount a coordinated attack on the center, Connor had the machine guns laying down overlapping fields of fire based on his positioning. One German soldier ran to within 5 yards of Connor with a grenade. Another American soldier saw it happening, saw Connor standing there completely exposed, saw the German with the grenade raised. For a moment, it looked like it was over. The other American yelled, fired at the German. The grenade went off, but the German soldier fell before he could throw it. Connor never moved, never looked, just kept firing at the next target. It became clear as the day went on that something extraordinary was happening. The Germans were taking losses at a rate that didn't match what should have been possible. Men were being shot by a defender they couldn't see. Squads were being pinned down and destroyed. Tank support wasn't helping because the snow was so deep that the tanks couldn't maneuver. What the German commander didn't realize was that he was facing one man who could see in conditions where his troops couldn't. One man whose mountain upbringing had given him a gift that no amount of training could teach. By noon, the German assault was flagging. The Germans were taking casualties at an unsustainable rate. Some of the younger German soldiers, Hitler Youth, drafted into the Waffen-SS, were starting to break. But the Germans were professionals. They regrouped. They tried a different approach. They'd bring supporting fire, suppress the American position, and then assault it in force. The American artillery, positioned behind K Company, began calling for fire direction. Connor was helping coordinate now, talking on radio, giving them German positions, calling in fire on German assembly areas. With bullets flying towards him from both directions, an official report would later state, Connor never wavered. His fighting spirit broke the back of the German assault.
As the day went on, Connor was hit, not once, multiple times. A bullet grazed his arm, leaving a deep cut. Blood ran down his sleeve, but he kept fighting. Shrapnel from a mortar round caught him in the leg. He should have gone down. Most men would have. Instead, he limped to a different position and kept fighting. His fellow soldiers watched him take these hits and keep moving. They saw him bleeding, they saw him limping, and they saw something in him that kept them fighting too. Because that was Lewis Connor's real gift. It wasn't that he was invulnerable. He wasn't. It was that he was unflinching. When he stood in the snow, wounded, with German bullets flying around him, still directing fire and still fighting, his men saw that, and they kept fighting. One by one, K Company's soldiers became infected with Connor's refusal to break. Men who should have been terrified became calm. Men who should have run held their ground. The machine guns kept firing, the rifles kept cracking, the mortar section kept dropping rounds on German positions. By mid-afternoon, the German assault was broken. Not defeated, not routed, but broken. The German commander realized his unit was suffering unsustainable casualties. He pulled them back. They'd try again tomorrow, when they could bring more tanks, when conditions were better. But K Company didn't break. The medical accounts from that day record what happened to Connor when the fighting stopped. He went to the medic station. He had to be practically dragged there by his fellow soldiers. He didn't want to go. He wanted to stay at his post. The medic examined him. Cut wounds from shrapnel, a bullet graze on his arm, a gunshot wound in his leg, multiple contusions, exposure, exhaustion. He should have been sent to hospital, one doctor wrote. By all rights, this man should be in a hospital bed. Instead, Connor stayed with K Company. Lewis Connor was born in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Not the polite, settled mountains of the East, the wild, unforgiving mountains where survival depended on skills passed down through generations. His father taught him to hunt when he was barely old enough to hold a rifle, not for sport, for food. In the mountains of Kentucky during the 1920s, hunting wasn't a hobby, it was life. If you couldn't shoot, your family went hungry. If you couldn't move through rough terrain, you got lost and died. The other boys in the mountains learned these skills too, but there was something different about Lewis Connor. The men who knew him said he had eyes like a hawk. He could spot movement in brush that other men simply couldn't see. When hunting, he didn't just track game. He seemed to understand the land itself, the way animals moved, where they'd go, how they thought. His father noticed it early. The boy was born to this, he said, born to see things other men miss. As Connor grew older, he worked the land like his family had for generations. He hunted to provide. He moved through rough country with an ease that made others look clumsy. He was quiet, didn't brag or boast, didn't need attention. He just worked, hunted, lived. To anyone watching, Lewis Connor was exactly what you'd expect from the Kentucky mountains: tough, self-reliant, and completely unremarkable. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Connor was a young man by then, not young enough to avoid the draft, old enough to know what it meant. When his notice came in 1942, he didn't fight it. He didn't try to get deferment. He packed his things and reported to basic training like thousands of American boys. But he wasn't like thousands of American boys. At basic training, the drill sergeants quickly realized something about Connor. While other soldiers struggled with basic marksmanship, Connor qualified as an expert. When other soldiers were lost navigating terrain courses, Connor could navigate in complete darkness. Officers pulled him aside almost immediately. Here, finally, was a weapon to use against the Germans. He was assigned to K Company, 34th Infantry, a rifle company. Not reconnaissance, not special forces, just regular infantry. But the officers knew what they had. They made him a squad leader. Then they made him a guide, the man who went ahead of patrols, who understood terrain and movement, who could keep men alive in difficult country. 1942 to 1944, Lewis Connor in North Africa and Italy. Connor saw combat first in North Africa, then Italy, month after month of frontline action. He was wounded multiple times, hit by shrapnel, shot by snipers, nearly killed by artillery fire. But each time he refused to be evacuated permanently. After hospital stays, he came back. His commanding officers wrote the same thing in his file repeatedly. Soldier is fearless under fire, maintains composure in extremely dangerous situations, continues to fight despite being wounded. By January 1945, Lewis Connor had seen more combat than most soldiers saw in entire wars. He had 7 Purple Heart wounds, 4 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, decorations for bravery that would have made other men famous, but almost nobody knew his name.
The battle reports came in. Military intelligence calculated German casualties. Best estimates put the number at 50 confirmed killed by Connor alone, another 150 wounded. The 6 Panzer tanks had to withdraw. The German assault had failed. K Company had lost 3 men killed, 12 wounded, but the position held. The German breakthrough was prevented. Reserves were able to arrive and stabilize the line. The entire flank didn't collapse. Connor's commanding officer wrote a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. It was one of the strongest recommendations ever submitted. The description of Connor's actions was detailed, specific, and extraordinary. For his fearless leadership, his willingness to stand in exposed positions under fire, his fearlessness in the face of overwhelming odds, his refusal to be evacuated despite multiple wounds, and his actions in holding a critical position against attack by superior German forces. The Medal of Honor recommendation went up the chain of command. And then something strange happened. It was lost. Or not lost exactly. Delayed, forgotten, shuffled aside by the normal chaos of wartime administration. The war went on. Connor stayed with K Company. More fights, more wounds, more days where he was shot at and survived through a combination of skill, luck, and that same iron determination. When the war ended, Connor was still alive, scarred, wounded, carrying shrapnel still embedded in his body from years of combat, but alive. He went home to Kentucky, back to the mountains. He didn't talk about the war. People asked him questions. What was it like, they'd say. "You must have done some incredible things." Connor would just shake his head. He'd smile in that quiet way of his, and he'd change the subject. He married, he had a family, he worked as a farmer, doing what his family had done for generations. By all accounts, he was a quiet man, good to his family, good to his neighbors, the kind of man people didn't really notice because he didn't draw attention to himself. The Medal of Honor recommendation sat in military files, forgotten.
Decades passed. Connor grew older. His hair turned grey and then white. His children grew up knowing their father had been in the war, but not really understanding what it meant. The specifics of what he'd done were buried in files and memories of men who'd died. Then, in 2006, something happened. A military historian was researching the Battle of the Bulge, going through archives. He came across Connor's recommendation for the Medal of Honor. He read the details of January 24th, 1945. He was amazed that no one knew this story. The historian contacted Connor. Connor was an old man by then, 70-something, still living in Kentucky, still farming, still quiet. The historian asked if he could help get the Medal of Honor recommendation approved. Connor said no, said it wasn't necessary, said he'd done what he had to do and that was enough. The historian pushed, said Connor's story deserved to be recognized, said the army should acknowledge what he'd done, said his children should know. Connor finally agreed, not happily, but he agreed. The Medal of Honor nomination went through the proper channels. 60 years after the battle, 6 decades after Connor had stood in the snow and held off 300 German soldiers, 60 years after he'd been wounded multiple times and kept fighting anyway. On March 23, 2006, Lewis Connor was officially awarded the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was held in Washington. Connor received the award from President George W. Bush. Photographs show an old man with white hair, humble, uncomfortable with the attention. When asked how he felt, Connor said, "I was just doing my job. The other fellas were doing their jobs too. I don't know why this took so long."
Lewis Connor died on June 12, 2007, at the age of 91. He lived quietly in Kentucky, never became famous, never wrote a book about his exploits, never gave speeches or appeared at public events. His fellow soldiers remembered him. Icy self-control, they said, absolutely fearless, the best soldier I ever knew. But what made Lewis Connor truly exceptional wasn't something that medals can capture. It wasn't the kills, it wasn't the hours of combat, it wasn't the wounds sustained or the tactical brilliance. It was something simpler. Lewis Connor, a poor farmer's son from the Cumberland Mountains, possessed a gift that no amount of training could teach. He could see what other men couldn't see. He could remain calm when other men broke. He could act with courage when other men froze. And when the moment came when his country needed someone to stand against overwhelming odds, in the snow, bleeding and wounded, Lewis Connor stood. Not because he was a hero, heroes are made by Hollywood, but because he was a man who understood in his bones that some things were worth standing for, that some moments demanded everything you had, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to act anyway. The German gun he picked up that day wasn't different from any other weapon, but in Lewis Connor's hands it became something more. It became the tool of a man who refused to break, a man who refused to run, a man who stood in the snow and held the line, and by doing that saved not just his unit, but changed the course of a battle that rippled through the entire war. Lewis Connor, the quiet farmer from Kentucky, a legend nobody knew about, until now.